good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining this session. I know you will be as excited as I am to hear what's up next and what each of our three panelists has to share with us today. So again, I'd like to welcome everyone to this session. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our three panelists. Our next gen leaders joining us in this conversation are Eyra Abraham, founder and CEO of Lisnen; Darby Lee Young, founder and principal of Level Playing Field; and Maayan Ziv, founder and CEO of AccessNow app. Welcome, and thank you all so much for joining us. Off, I'd like to ask each of you for an introduction. So could you please introduce yourself, telling us what you do, and in particular, what do you cite among your current greatest accomplishments? I'd like to start things off with Eyra to begin.
Yes, thank you so much for having me here today. Great opportunity to be here. So I started my business, like many of us, trying to solve a pain point. I'm somebody who happened to have a hearing loss ever since I was the age of 3. And an incident happened a couple of years ago in Nova Scotia, in the condo building that I was living at the time. And I slept through a fire drill and only found out about the fire drill a couple of days later with the property management, explaining the situation of the seriousness of fire alarms. And at that point, I started looking for technology and couldn't find anything. And so I looked upon solving the problem myself. And I saw an opportunity using artificial intelligence, and particularly AI and advanced technology to help automate specific tasks that many people with disability can't do by creating technology that enables them. And so with Lisnen, we are building using artificial intelligence, using smart technologies, and to give people a notice of information whenever there's something, a sound that requires their immediate attention, they can leverage technology to enable them to do so. And so I've been very passionate, and one of the greatest achievements is being able to advocate for AI and people with disability, because this is a field that is new and in advance. And like many experiences in the past, we've seen technology tend to exclude people with disability, and to being in the forefront and seeing the opportunities has been a great achievement of mine as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Eyra. And next to Darby for an introduction.
Thank you so much for having me today. It's an absolute pleasure to be part of this group and to speak. I'm the founder and principal of Level Playing Field. I'm a former para-alpine ski racer that is located in Calgary, but I own Level Playing Field, and we're an accessibility consulting firm that works across the country. So we're coast to coast to coast, removing barriers for persons with disabilities, sort of in the built environment, working on new builds, but also auditing existing as a for-profit organization. I started it because as a person with cerebral palsy and trying to get around, I had great difficulties trying to enjoy life and have fun with my friends. And so by having Level Playing Field, we're sort of taking it to a new level. We're making sure, especially on the new commercial builds, that people with disabilities feel warm and welcome, and that we can truly thrive in our communities and feel engaged instead of left out and not feel like equal members of society.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Darby. And finally to Maayan with this question.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Maayan Ziv, based in Toronto. And, at this point, you'll probably figure out that this is a panel very much focused on kind of equity and disability inclusion. And similarly, I started my business because I faced similar challenges to my colleagues. I have always used a wheelchair, and the world is riddled with barriers. And I just asked myself, why is it that my experience is not the same as my sisters or my friends or my colleagues in school or the people I work with? Why is it that I have to work 10 times harder to show up and still often be stranded in the street and not be able to access a space? And so that was really the question and then the frustration in my life that led to the development of AccessNow. And really, in short, AccessNow is a tech company that is providing people with a go-to resource for accessibility information. We work directly with businesses to verify their status of accessibility, and we promote that through the use of kind of minute data points, down to the lived experiences of thousands of people across Canada and beyond, that we can actually show up and say, with this data, we have the power to create connected, equitable cities and empower public policy leaders to actually make decisions that remove barriers instead of invest in new ones. So it helps people get around, like myself. Now I can know what is accessible, how, and why. And we also work at kind of the highest levels of government to work with people to actually remove barriers as well. So really excited to be here. And I think that's really what I'm most excited about, is conversations like these, where we kind of create even more awareness about why these matters are important.
Okay. What I'm noticing is there are so many commonalities between you in terms of the innovations you've spearheaded and how you've really taken a step forward just to make things better for everyone, really. So that is amazing. And thank you for giving such a great overview to your personal and professional backgrounds and experience just to get us started here. So turning to this question, I would like to ask you, through the pandemic, what has been or are your greatest needs as a female entrepreneur? And I would like to call on Darby to begin.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. I think, through the pandemic, as a female, and I'm sure the other ladies on the call would agree with me, I think as also a person with a disability, finding the balance of being able to get work done, having the ability to work, but also seeing that with the pandemic, we've learned that we can work anywhere in the world. I'm actually currently sitting in Winnipeg right now, so I'm not even in my office. But I think for me, the greatest struggle has always been, not just with the pandemic, but with work alone, is being treated as an equal member and getting funding and having the understanding that we do belong. And I think with COVID and with the pandemic, the virtual world has definitely made a difference, because we've been able to hire more persons with disabilities to be involved in conversations, involved in projects that necessarily wouldn't have been able to because of our built environment being such a barrier for persons with disabilities. I think the biggest thing for me is that we always need to see people for people, and making sure that whether it's a pandemic or a new world, that everybody should get the equal chance of surviving and having their own businesses or working for different organizations. And if we don't have the supports in place for people like myself, then we're kind of left out hanging, basically.
Mm-hmm. That is a very rich thought that you shared, Darby. So thank you so much. Next to Maayan.
I think when I look at what we've been through, there's a really unique conflict that every person has had to face, which is, for the majority of lockdowns, people were extremely frustrated because they didn't have access. All of a sudden, an experience that I have had as a person with a physical disability was one that I was hearing from every person that I was speaking to. Oh, I wish I could just go do X, Y, and Z. Oh, it's so frustrating to me, this and that. And that experience of literally being locked down is the experience that people with disabilities have on a daily basis. And I remember the irony of early days in the pandemic being that, don't worry, the only people who will be kind of at most risk are people with disabilities or people with underlying health conditions. And as an entrepreneur, with multiple different facets to my identity, the intersectionality that I experienced as a business leader, as someone who was at the forefront of innovation, and yet someone who was being told that my life was less valuable than others, was a really difficult thing to process. And so I think when we move through the pandemic now, into not with messaging of COVID is over, but that we have to learn to live differently. I think the silver lining is that we have all gone through an event that asks us to kind of engage in the empathy that we need in order to help each other, in order to survive. And I think that empathy is what makes great leaders. That's the empathy that makes strong CEOs and entrepreneurs and women who lead the best businesses. And so I think learning from the lessons of disability and learning from what it takes to kind of pause and ask people, what do you need? How can I help you? How can I make sure that you're able to show up still, feel supported, and that it's equitable and inclusive? I think, those are the lessons that we have to bring with us as we kind of build back from a really challenging time, because many people are still facing isolation. Many people are still feeling, the very difficult kind of marks that we've lived through over the last 2-3 years, going on 3 years almost. So that's kind of how I reflect on it, is that the pandemic has brought both a very difficult time for many people who are still struggling, but I think also the opportunity for awareness that there were fractures in our systems before, and that those have now been exploded. And as leaders, we have a responsibility and an opportunity to recognize those and build better systems that support diverse founders and diverse business leaders.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Maayan. And now over to Eyra with the question.
Yes, no, and just to tap into the last point that Maayan mentioned in terms of entrepreneurs with disability, there's a small group of us, and just 0.5% of us in Canada who are entrepreneurs with disability. And so part of that challenge I experienced during the COVID is network and connecting and meeting people. As a person with disability, I've been a consumer of the product and the problem that I've been dealing with. And now being on the other side of the page or the table, it really requires me to build those new networks and build those new relationships. And when you have a COVID, it's quite challenging in that sense to meet people in the ways that you normally would in person and build those long-term relationships that can really strengthen the business. So that's one thing that I saw was a really big challenge. The other thing is it comes to when you're doing advanced technology, and a lot of assistive technology start as the really unique products that use high-level knowledge and expertise. And what I found, particularly with artificial intelligence, the capital and the resources for talent here in Canada were very limited. And so it made it very challenging to really access the talent needed. And of course, when you want to try to get VC to come in, you want to be able to pay for the top talent to help build these top technologies. VCs in an assistive technology area are very far and few. They made it very challenging for entrepreneurs like myself to actually access capital when we try to make the great case of why assistive technology is a worthwhile investment when you don't have examples of that happening in the past. So those were really the two things that I saw as the biggest challenge. But I do see during the pandemic, there's slowly some shift and things improving in that area. But I do think that those are really the same problems that as entrepreneurs with disabilities, any other type of entrepreneurs, we all experience the same thing. And so I think it's really critical that we acknowledge that we need to continue to build these networks and relationships that we can continue to strengthen our businesses. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you all for offering your insights. I was really taken by the overall theme of empathy. And interestingly enough, I think that through speaking, you are building empathy. And I mean, I certainly know in my role working with entrepreneurs with disabilities or job seekers with disabilities over the years, there's never really a surprise that comes, my way. I'm not surprised that I'm going to be surprised, and I'm continually learning and growing in my work. So if there's a positive there, you have a lot of means to, I think, build that empathy, which Maayan, you identified as really being foundational. So thank you all for that. Now moving to a change in perspective here. My next question turns things around a bit. And I'd like to ask you, as we look to the post-pandemic period, what do you see in the future? What are you most excited or optimistic about? So what do we have to look forward to, in your opinion? So first, I would like to begin with Maayan.
Sure. So I touched on it a little bit, but I'm going to kind of push even harder. And I'm used to being the one who makes people a little bit uncomfortable, but hopefully it's in a way to help you grow. I think what happened during the course of the pandemic is that we had these mass communities raise their voices on extremely important issues. We had the riots of George Floyd. We had the trauma and the challenges that we saw with the unmarked graves in the Indigenous communities. And in general, we've heard from communities that haven't had the platform or their equity that they need to actually be at the same level. And I think, we listened, and it continues to be, and it's a different time than before because we are listening. And I think that we have an opportunity once again through this time where we realize that we actually are all connected. That, if someone who's not feeling well goes into a room, that whole room, is somehow now connected to that instance, that we don't all live on islands, and that our movements and the actions that we create in our world, they have repercussions, and positive outsources can actually happen as well. And so I think it is a time, moving kind of out of this period to look at, who hasn't been given that opportunity, who has so much to offer, but still, there are barriers in their way from being, from reaching their full potential, from being able to offer the expertise and the insights that they have. And I think one of our strengths in Canada is that we are such a diverse country. People come from everywhere and have phenomenal insights to share, but certain voices have been prioritized over others. And so I think, what I'm most excited about is highlighting those stories. At AccessNow, that's what we do. We highlight the stories of people with lived experience of disability to help create more connected and meaningful understandings of how to build more inclusive and accessible cities. And I think likewise, in every business right now, there's an opportunity to kind of uncover what we might not have wanted to talk about and to be a little bit uncomfortable in order to grow. And I really, truly think that that's the best version of progress. So that's what I'm most excited about.
Great. Thank you, Maayan. And now turning things over to Eyra.
Yeah, I'm going to say the same thing. But one thing I've noticed that I'm hopeful about is this sort of shift in perspective that is happening in our society. And it kind of brings me back to some of the past things that we've experienced in our world. And when it comes to people with disability, way back when we had the World War, there were many people who were in the war and became people with disabilities because they got injured during the war. And during that time, there was a shift in perspective that we want to make sure that some of the armies and military will have integrate back into the society. And so we started to see new buildings be more accommodating for people. And I think COVID is going to be doing the same thing as well, really shifting our perspective and bringing more inclusive and diversity and inclusion, whether through the workplace. But one thing that I see and what I'm really hopeful is the beginning of access for people with disability. And even just to start to get in is a big achievement in this sector. And so I think it's really important that we acknowledge that the advancement that we have had in the past and how we're moving forward into the future. And so, yeah, that's what I'm really hopeful for about.
Okay. So finally, Darby, what are your thoughts here?
I think like I'm gonna second both Eyra and Maayan's comments too. Is I think, you know, overall, my most excitement is the fact that, yeah, sadly it took a pandemic, sadly it took George Floyd and all these things to happen, where people are now starting to see the importance of accessibility, inclusion, diversity, and equity within everywhere, no matter where we go, whether it's hotels, restaurants, workplaces, all that. It's really opened everybody's eyes. So I'm excited because we're starting to see more pickup in the importance of it. And as much as it's, you know, for some people, it's always been there. But others, it's a new learning curve. And now they're looking back and seeing, oh, did I say that before? Oh, can't say that now. But the whole inclusion aspect and making sure that people can get in places, and the reactions now towards persons with disabilities, at least for me, at least out traveling and stuff like that, are a lot different, because people are now learning about it, where before it was sort of an afterthought in the background type thing. So I'm excited for, you know, a lot more conversations about the DEI stuff all around, and what society sort of brings to us and what we look like as we move forward. Because as I said before in my opening, we're all people and we need to be seen as people first, versus, oh, you're the person that walks funny. You know, that type of stuff. I want to be seen as Darby, the person with level playing field, somebody who's been able to make a difference, versus the gimpy one that rides around in a scooter and runs over people if they get in the way, which honestly I do to some extent. But it's the matter of, you know, having that sort of respect and not being like, oh, I feel bad for you, sorry you're in that situation. Well, actually, yeah, I've been in this situation my entire life. I don't know anything different. You're temporarily able-bodied. I'm not. So it's the excitement of the conversations of people actually understanding and seeing some of the barriers that we've dealt with and how to move forward on those as we move. Yeah.
All for topping things off with your answers. You've all mentioned some amazing points that we can all reflect on as we envision moving ahead from the pandemic into a period of optimism and strength. Again, the common theme I heard just was really that it's time to sort of stand up and take notice. And on the positive, that seems to be happening as we speak. So couldn't think of anything more positive to really close off those first set of questions with. So thank you again. Now we do have time to take one question from the audience today. And the question that has come in is, what is your one piece of advice to other young entrepreneurs starting out? So I think I will begin with Eyra again. Eyra, if you'd like to provide an answer to that question, that'd be great to start us off.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. One advice for an entrepreneur starting out, and I would say, is build your skills and confidence in the space. And that's what I would say, because I think one of the biggest challenge of entrepreneurship is that you're going through the journey of unknown and new territories and new discoveries. And part of that will require some sort of grounded up techniques that you can adopt to make sure that you're comfortable in this box. Get comfortable with uncomfortable, essentially, what the entrepreneurship is all about. But also just really networking. I think one of the advice that if I were to look at and go through the whole process of entrepreneurship and starting at a young age, I would actually look into building relationship, meeting new people, and really growing my network in all areas. So when you come into the entrepreneurship with whatever idea that you have and that you want to take forward, you got all this great asset of resources to tap into. So yeah, like that would be my advice overall. Yeah.
Okay, and turning it over to Darby.
Thanks, Henry. I think for me, the biggest one that I've learned is like Eyra said, like networking, but for me would be never taking no as an answer. Like never, when somebody says no, don't take that as being, oh, I'm not going to succeed. Because you never know unless you ask the question. So the biggest thing that I've always learned through working and through starting the company and everything is always asking. And never being afraid of the word no. And if it's a no, then you just go to the next person. But you also never know if it's a no unless you ask. So you've always got to get up the confidence to ask somebody and ask somebody for help. If you need funding or whatever it is, ask the questions because you just never know what's going to happen.
That reminds me just of the advice, just put one foot in front of the other. And, it really rings true, doesn't it?
Correct.
Okay. So finally, with Maayan, what do you have to offer on this question?
I think for sure there's been some really great advice so far in response to the question. I think one thing that I can add kind of beyond, being resilient, bouncing back and recognizing that your network is your most valuable asset. I think for me, kind of one more thing I'd add into the mix is, when you're starting out, find what makes you special, what makes you different, and recognize that uniqueness is a gift, and learn to love that about yourself. I think one of the challenges we face as entrepreneurs is that we look at kind of success stories, and sometimes they don't look that diverse. A lot of success stories that we'll see in mainstream media, might be male, might be white, might be straight, might be a very specific type of person. And I think, finding deep down in you what makes you unique, what makes you someone that people will want to listen to and help and talk to and learn to love that about yourself, not apologize for it. I think that sense of confidence, when you can find it in yourself, is truly contagious. And I think the best entrepreneurs figured out how to channel that confidence into building the network and into building the next steps for success. So, don't be apologetic about who you are on this earth. Learn to love that about yourself. And soon enough, you'll find that you attract others who very much love that about you too.
Thank you all for your input to that additional question. At this point, we're now moving to wrap up the conversation. Thank you, everyone, for all those insights. Such an inspiring conversation to have, and really a wonderful way to wind down our program.